mixing our dry ingredients together, that is our flour and salt, and if you are making this crust for a dessert, such as with the strawberry or lemon tart, then let's add a tablespoon of sugar. But we'll leave the sugar out if we are making this for a savory recipe, such as for our quiche. Now it's time to add the olive oil to our crust. There's a reason I didn't measure out the olive oil before starting the crust, because I've found over the years from testing crusts many times that it's better not to follow the recipe to a T when adding your fat, whether it's olive oil, butter, vegan butter, coconut oil. I found it's really about following the texture and not the recipe. But I do hear some of you thinking, oh no, I need to follow the recipe. And I know there are recipe followers out there. So I will say it usually comes out to about a 1/3 cup olive oil. But the reason I love using olive oil is that it's so easy to just incorporate as you go, because it's pourable, it's liquid. It's not like coconut oil or butter that needs to be cut into the crust. So really what you want when you're making a crust is that the flour is fully coated with the fat, and that's how you'll know that you've added enough fat. So once the flour gets fully coated and it's not dry, it should be nice and crumbly all throughout. It should be evenly crumbly. The great thing about doing it this way, adding as you go, using oil, is that you're not using too much. You're just using what you need and no more, and that's always a good thing. So as you can see, my flour is starting to crumble. And really we want this flour to be moist before we even add our water to the crust. And I will say that as someone who tries to eat healthy, I have tried many times to reduce oil or reduce fat in a crust, and I have found that with the shortbread crust for a quiche or tart, really just don't try to skimp on the oil. And how you can check if you've added enough oil is to just put your hand in there and feel it. It should kind of stick together already. So that's how you know the flour is fully moisturized. I'm going to add a little bit more here. Yeah, the thing about a shortbread crust, the great thing is that the more fat, the better the taste. So you really can't add too much here. It's really about adding too little. So don't worry too much about adding, don't worry about adding too much. Worry about adding too little of oil into a shortbread crust. And do you see how nice this is now, my crust? It's really nice and crumbly before I've even added my liquid. So now it's time to add in my water. I usually need about a 1/2 cup of water, but again, same with the water, better to follow texture rather than an exact measurement. So here, nice and crumbly, and I'm just going to add a little bit of water at a time. And basically we want the crust to come together into a ball easily, but not be so gooey that we can't make it into a ball. So you might just need, depending on how much oil you used, you might need a couple tablespoons, you might need 1/2 cup of water. Well, I'm not going to add any more water here because I'm also going to add some apple cider vinegar. This is a trick I've learned that actually helps keep our crust soft, because the vinegar tenderizes the flours and inhibits the gluten from forming, and the gluten is what makes a crust too tough, like cardboard. So by adding a vinegar to this, we're going to actually soften up and tenderize our crust. So I would suggest adding the vinegar before you've added in all the water, so that you don't Okay, and we're rolling again. Try not to spill your water everywhere like me. I'm just going to add a little more. And I will say that the more times you make a crust, the more you'll just get a feel. It's really about using your hands. One of the great things about cooking, one of the best things, is using all your senses and playing with texture, feeling things. It's like being a kid again, playing with Play-Doh. So, do you see how cleanly this is coming together now? I can just wipe the sides of the bowl and it just almost on its own accord forms into a ball. That's what we want. We want a dough that's easy to work with. So there, I'm going to form it into a ball. And now we're going to let this dough rest for at least an hour. You can let it rest overnight too. If you let it rest overnight, wrap it in film wrap, saran wrap, cling wrap, so that it doesn't dry out, and put it in the fridge. For me, I'm going to be making this today, I'm just letting it rest for an hour out of the fridge on my counter. And what that does is, like I mentioned with the gluten, that letting it rest helps the gluten and the flours relax, the flour and the gluten relax, so that our crust is not too tough. Now that our crust has been resting for an hour, it's time to roll it out and get it into the oven. So I'm going to start with preheating the oven to 176 Celsius or 350 Fahrenheit. Here's our dough ready to go, nice and soft, easy to work with. I'm going to flour my surface. And actually, before I roll out my dough, first I want to get my tart pan ready so that I can just easily transfer the dough into here and that it's ready to go. So we're going to grease our tart pan with olive oil, or if you're using vegan butter, coconut oil, that works too. I want to show you my tart pan, which I love. It has a removable bottom, which makes it really easy to make a beautiful tart crust, and to easily, once it's done baking, just pop the whole tart right out and put it onto a pretty serving platter. So if you can find one of these nice non-stick tart pans with a removable base, I highly recommend it. They also have the silicone ones now that are very easy to use because you can just bend the baking dish, the silicone pan, right off the crust. So my surface is floured, and before I start rolling this, I actually want to try to make it as evenly thick as possible all around, because then that will affect the evenness of the actual crust in the end. We want it to be evenly thick all the way across. Looks good. I don't push too hard, and my focus when I'm rolling is keeping the dough evenly thick and round. That's what I focus on. So just take your time with that, and only roll it a little bigger than your tart pan so that you're not cutting off too much excess dough in the end. In France, most people just buy store-bought crust because they're so easy to find here. They have a whole aisle of tart crust, quiche crust, pizza crust, vegan, non-vegan. So there's really no need to even make one at home here, except that it is healthier to make one at home. But I know that outside France, the options are more limited. So it's nice to know how to make your own at home. I'm just going to put my tart pan on top to see how much bigger. I need to go bigger. Okay. I think that looks good. An easy way to get our dough off of our workspace and into our tart pan is to use our rolling pin. Just gently wrap the dough around the rolling pin and use it to drape it neatly into our tart pan. See? No breakage here. And then readjust so that it's kind of even all the way around. Once we've got our crust into the pan, we're going to take a knife and cut off the excess neatly so that our crust looks really nice and even. I usually save the scraps for my daughter to play with as Play-Doh. There we go. Now we're going to prick the base of our crust all over with a fork, which will help vent it so that when it's baking it doesn't bubble up, but bakes flat and evenly. If you were making this for a quiche or a savory tart or something where you're going to bake the filling, then you can just leave it right here and add your filling now. Or if you are making this for a sweet tart where you're not, or even a savory one, where you are not going to bake the filling, then you will want to blind bake this first. And blind baking just means that you are pre-baking the crust before the filling. So what you'll need for that is a sheet of parchment paper and a bowl of dry beans or rice. If you have pie weights at home, that works too. Dry beans work great though. And we're just going to weight our pie down so that again, when it's baking, without a filling pushing down on it, it can tend to bubble up when it's baking. But by putting this weight on it, we're gonna make sure that it bakes evenly. So scrunch up your parchment paper. This will make it more malleable. Now, fit it into the crust. This also protects the edge from browning too much because oftentimes the edge will cook faster than the base. So by doing this, we're protecting the edge. Add our beans. That's going to weight it. And now this is ready to go into the oven. Set the timer to 20 minutes. After 20 minutes, we will remove the parchment paper and the beans and bake it another 5-10 minutes, which will allow the crust to be nice and browned. It's been 20 minutes. Time to take off the parchment paper and the beans. I set the timer to 5 minutes usually, and that's usually enough, but sometimes you'll need up to 10 minutes. That looks good. Nice and golden, but still soft. Yeah, perfect. We're going to make a very easy gluten-free crust. Of course, you can use a gluten-free all-purpose flour if that's what you like, if you have one that you like. But if you don't have that in the house, I want to show you how you can make something very quickly with oats. If you are worried about the gluten, make sure that this is gluten-free certified. The oats are gluten-free certified. You can of course use oat flour, but I don't have oat flour. I just have quick oats in my house because I eat these every day for breakfast. So I'm going to make my own oat flour by processing these in the processor into a flour. Okay, and this looks good. It's not a powder, but it's a flour. It doesn't have to be as fine as a powder. It can be coarse. And then it's the same concept as the all-purpose flour crust that we made. We're going to add some salt. If you are making this for a sweet crust, add some sugar. If you are making it for the quiche, don't add the sugar. And with the oat crust, I do find we need a little less oil and less liquid because oats are a little more moist than all-purpose flour. So again, just like with the all-purpose flour crust, measure the oil as you go, but don't skimp on the oil until you get a nice crumble. You can get your hand in here and feel out the flour. Make sure that the flour should all be fully coated with oil, and it looks like it is here. This is looking good. So I'm going to add a little water because, like I said, with the oat crust, we don't need as much. I have half a cup measured out here. That's my standard that I always just have with the crust. ready to go, but I usually don't need that much. As you can see, my oat crust is sticking together now, which is what we want. And unlike with the all-purpose flour, we're not going to shape this into a ball and roll it out. We're just going to dump it into our tart pan, grease our tart pan, dump the flour in, and then shape the crust right in the pan, because the oat flour is too crumbly to roll it out. It will just break apart. So what I like to do is first allot my edge, because that's so important. So I make sure I have enough for my edges, and then I use the remainder to create the base, because we're going to need more flour for the edges than for the base. So I go all the way around. My edge is good now, so I'm going to dump the rest in for the base and use my hands to slowly, patiently and slowly, that's always hard for me to be patient when I'm cooking, but turn this into a crust. So just pat it in and try to even it out. You want to get it as even as possible. Try to make sure that you fill in any holes here, because the oat flour is a lot more rough and crumbly than the all-purpose flour, so it's not going to have a clean finish, and that's okay. It tastes so good, and it's, like I said, it's easy because not everyone has access to gluten-free all-purpose flour. I know for me it's hard to find it in France. Actually, it's not just readily available, so that's why I wanted to give you this as an option. So then I use my thumb to shape the top and just try to make it look as much as possible like a pretty crust. So once it gets to where you like it, you think it looks good, up to your standard, we all have different standards, then voila, you can now proceed to either blind bake it like I showed you with the all-purpose crust. So you put the parchment paper and beans and blind bake it for the sweet crust, or you would fill it with your quiche filling. And there we go.